Series, it's cybersecurity headlines.
Facebook deletes 1 billion face prints in face recognition shutdown. Iranian Black Shadow hacking group breaches Israeli internet hosting firm and releases sensitive files. Bonus. And global chip shortage is far from over as wait times get even longer. These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have been bringing to you on this week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we get a chance for some insight, some expertise, and certainly some opinion on these stories and more from our guest, Davi Ottenheimer, the VP of Trust and Digital Ethics at Inrupt. Davi, thank you so much for being here. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We also want to thank our sponsor, Trend Micro, for helping make the show happen. We will hear from them in just a little bit. And remember, you can join us on LinkedIn Live now. Go to the CISO series page on LinkedIn. You can follow us there. Join in the chat. All sorts of good times can be had. We have just 20 minutes, though, so let's dive right in. Facebook deletes that billion face prints in face recognition shutdown. Facebook announced Tuesday that they plan to abandon their use of face recognition system and delete over 1 billion facial recognition profiles in the coming weeks. They recently reached a $650 million legal settlement in Illinois, which claimed the company collected and stored biometric data of their users without consent. Now, just for some clarification here, there's been some later reporting on this that Meta is not giving up the algorithm that's behind this or just deleting this data set for Facebook specifically. But Davi, there's some interesting, I mean, obviously a ton of privacy concerns with this whole system in general. And when it comes to shutting this thing down, Facebook was kind of quick to point out, this is going to not be great. All these alt captions for a lot of these photos for the blind and visually impaired are also going to go away with this system. I'm curious what your, overall take here. Does that hold any water of, why Facebook was doing this and kind of your thoughts?
It doesn't smell right to me, right? It doesn't pass the sniff test. I think what's going on here is that Facebook's feeling the heat. They had a lot of leakage, a lot of internal documents being leaked, and I think they're scared. And I think what they're doing is deleting a lot of this data because they know that they had a breach and they know that they've done things that are criminal and they're trying to cover it up. And the reports that go out and say Facebook is stopping facial recognition are absolutely false because they, in their own statement, say we're not stopping this, we're still doing it. I think it's just a giant cover-up story. And I think the Clearview decision in Australia also scared them because you have the British and the Australians and the Canadians going after Clearview for basically saying they violated the law. And Facebook is probably, there's probably a smoke coming out of the building in the headquarters right now as they burn all their documents to cover up all their mistakes.
Yeah, I wonder if this is a situation, Illinois is not the only, they probably have the most forward-facing biometric law with this. I do wonder if this is crossing their T's and dotting their lowercase j's to, be in compliance with that in some, deleting some data, still wanting their pie and eating it too. We will see in the coming weeks if that holds any water. I mean, is there anything Facebook could do to reassure you on a privacy front in this regard, Davi?
Well, transparency is key here. So if they were actually transparent with what they're doing, but they're doing the opposite, they're doing their usual dance where they say, we only kept this data so that the blind could see better. And that's just totally, absolutely false. And they're throwing the blind under the bus because now you're supposed to get angry at the blind, for wanting this service. Facebook absolutely did the wrong thing and has been doing the wrong thing since its inception. And so for them to say now, oh, okay, we'll have to get rid of this really wonderful thing. Sorry, guys. I think it's a cover up. And I think the fact that the newspapers and journalists willfully reported the PR statement that Facebook was ending facial recognition is totally disinformation. It's just giving everybody the wrong impression entirely, which is why we're all confused because we're ending this. And then immediately people said, no, they're not. They're starting it up right away. That's what the confusion comes from, Facebook basically running gaslighting and PR. So it's a cover up.
All right, next here, Iranian Black Shadow hacking group breaches Israeli internet hosting firm. The group compromised the server of the Israeli internet hosting company CyberServe, taking down several of the sites that host and has since released files containing highly sensitive information belonging to medical patients and members of the LGBTQ community. Israel's National Cyber Directorate, not an imposing name at all, has reportedly warned CyberServe several times that its IT systems were vulnerable. This event happened in Israel, Davi, but it's kind of a constant anywhere in the world. Leaked data can result in, the dangers of to innocent people who have nothing to do with that internet host, kind of liable for their bad IT practices, seemingly. Could you see these types of breaches moving into a criminal liability space for internet companies, or are we already seeing that?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there is some case to be made for people doing things the wrong way for so long, and criminal liability does make sense to me. to some degree for vendors as well, people who have set up the things in the way that the defaults are wrong and they leave people exposed. But the state level attribution in this story sort of gets away from the point that, this is really an anti-child, anti-rights story. The people who are attacking are trying to do harm to particular communities. I mean, literally children and sexual orientation, right? So the targeting of children and dating apps, I think, is probably a better way to phrase this rather than state. And I think I would rather see a shift towards away from state level attribution or even governments and towards large organized criminal groups or large groups of very politically motivated attackers. It could be a group in Florida that hates gays that's going after these people. And Iran, I think, is the wrong attribution. I doubt it's actually Iran.
Yeah, I think there is always some confusion when it comes to and part of this is by design, right? By these groups, by classifying them as APTs. It's easy to say, okay, this group is linked to this state sponsor or something like that, but it gets very fuzzy very quickly. Again, I think kind of by design for a lot of these operations for sure. Next up here, Microsoft to work with U.S. community colleges to fill 250,000 cybersecurity jobs. Almost got the number there. This is a 4-year project intended to address the country's cybersecurity workforce shortage. We've covered this at length on the show a number of times. Microsoft's commitment will include training for faculty, free curriculum, and scholarships. CEO Brad Smith explained that U.S. community colleges are cheaper to attend and are more diverse in terms of graduates and are located in every U.S. state and are just more flexible with student programs. Sounds like a positive step and one that will certainly make this kind of training more accessible, or at least that's how Microsoft is framing it here. What advice would you give to Microsoft or do the colleges looking to help make these programs a success?
Well, since we just got off the topic of criminal liability, so the first thing I'd say is Bill Gates should probably fund this personally for creating so much security violations in the world by default. I mean, the fact that he gets away with, not having to pay for all the mistakes he made is criminal in itself. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, they created the worst operating system in history, arguably. I don't think the problem is like getting faculty funds or putting money into schools. I feel like this is false charity. I think what they really need to be doing is training people on the job. It would be much more meaningful if they announced that they were just hiring people. They were hiring 250,000 people and they were giving them a chance to do the work right then and there, regardless of whether they went to college or not. And that's what sort of bothers me a lot about this idea of a shortage to me is totally misplaced. And the idea that there's a pipeline issue is totally misplaced. I think those are false. And I think that narrative needs to stop. I know people who have lots of degrees and have all the qualifications and they're stopped because they're told they don't have experience on the job. And so that's, I think, the real story here, which is Microsoft is denying people jobs without something. And they say it's degrees, but I don't believe them.
Well, the only thing I would say to that is, and I agree with you that, having that gap in or not having that experience on your resume definitely is a resounding pain point. And we've talked about that on Defense in Depth and other shows on the CISO network for sure. The one thing I would say is not even the danger, but like making this a Microsoft employment program, to me, I would then say that my argument would be this potentially then locks people more so in as opposed to a curriculum where theoretically there's a wider education base that's non-Microsoft specific. Now, I don't know if Microsoft is going to say, hey, everything needs to be .NET and, everything needs to be Microsoft specific if we're going to be funding it. I wouldn't be surprised if they did. But I could see that the other way. I do agree, though, that, better than a free scholarship is, hey, pay me while I learn this on the job and then I have a job, which makes it much more sustainable long term. I do agree with that for sure.
Yeah, I just would totally push back on them and say, why are you just putting money into schools? You should do that anyway. If you really wanted to hire people to get rid of the shortage, just hire people.
Yeah,
and train them on the job.
Hit it from both sides for sure. Global chip shortage is far from over as wait times get longer. According to the Wall Street Journal, the global semiconductor shortage is worsening, with wait times lengthening, buyers hoarding products, and the potential end looking less likely to materialize by the next year. What's left is widespread confusion from manufacturers and buyers alike, with some delivery dates stretching to 2024. We've seen this. I think confusion is definitely the order of the day. We've seen the automotive industry hit on this side, delaying, cutting productions, just stopping shipments. We've seen Qualcomm coming out and saying that, hey, they see their supply getting better by the start of next year. And then we're seeing, basically every other consumer company saying we have no visibility into when this will get better. So, Davi, my question for you, the government has made some moves to help U.S. companies manufacture chips locally, but do you see this as a follow-on effect from the pandemic, or is it time now to bring more of this manufacturing back, domestic?
Well, it reminds me a lot of the capacitor plague from years ago. I don't know how many people even remember that or even knew about that. The capacitor plague was a huge problem, and not that many people seem to be that affected by it. I mean, there were fires in computers, fires in data centers, and it was a huge, huge issue for those of us inside the industry. I think the better way of framing this issue is that people should use less chips. That's very unpopular opinion. I think, but if you want the fair phone route, right? This is a phone that says you can upgrade and repair and replace parts of your machine as opposed to replacing the entire machine and all the chips with an entirely new machine and all the chips. We would have less pressure. So the first is the supply issue is probably too much of a focus. We should talk about the demand. Why are we demanding so many chips so often? Get rid of that model, be less consumerist. In terms of the supply, yeah, we could probably do more domestic production. That would be awesome. But I think a better way of looking at it first is to ask why we're consuming so much and throwing away so many. It's just ridiculous how many phones people cycle through, and Apple in particular is, really egregious at trying to force people to upgrade and get rid of their old phones and all their old dongles and creating all this landfill.
I do wonder also if long-term we'll see a shift away, or maybe a hedge against just-in-time manufacturing that all of these companies now effectively live on, and having to think of longer-term supply chains. If this continues on till 2024, even into 2025, if we'll see some kind of hedge against that for sure.
Yeah, let me say, 1996, 1997, I actually had 3 engineers working for me when I was head of security at this particular facility, and they were desoldering and resoldering boards on machines that we would keep in production for decades. And that to me is a much better route. The microphone I'm talking to you on right now, I desoldered and resoldered so I could get it working again. And I think just too few people are thinking about that. So there's domestic production of chips, but there's also just domestic repair of machines using chips in the recycling program.
For sure. All right. Before we move on to our next story, we wanted to spend a few moments and thank our sponsor for today, Trend Micro.
And now a word from our sponsor, Trend Micro. Re-image your cloud. That's the theme for CloudSec 2021, a 3-day global event that will be held virtually starting on November 16th. Learn the latest trends in cloud and cybersecurity with global keynotes and session tracks tailored to your role's unique challenges. Test your skills and win prizes in the 24-hour CloudSec Challenge, a hands-on, immersive experience that has something for everyone, from novice application coders to experienced security practitioners. Join for free on November 16th. Sign up at CloudSec, that's cloudsec.com.
All right, macOS Flaw opens door to undetectable malware. Dun, dun, dun. Security researchers at Microsoft discovered a flaw in macOS's System Integrity Protection, or SIP, which would have allowed an attacker to install a hardware interface that allows them to overwrite system files or install persistent undetectable malware. That's the quote. Apple subsequently patched the issue in macOS Monterey, Catalina, and Big Sur. Davi, one of the things that sticks out to me is undetectable malware. Does that worry you?
Yeah, of course. Although I have to say, slightly tongue-in-cheek, undetectable malware to me sounds like antivirus. I mean, so many people run antivirus and it has so much power over the system, and they have no idea what it's doing on their system. And a lot of people, governments even, get away with using that and abusing that because that's basically a backdoor into the system. People have no idea what antivirus is really doing to their machines, but they still agree to it because they think it's benefiting them in some way. I think the story here is two-part. One, Apple is wrong in the sense that they have such a tight grip on their systems. In some sense, they false advertise the safety and security of them, and it turns out to be not so great. And they need more transparency. They need more of a market ecosystem of third-party validation. The flip side of that is, of course, other vendors are as bad or worse, right? You look at Google's recent problem with the COVID app, where they had this very special privilege that allowed certain apps to have access to the logs, and they're putting medical data in the logs. Same thing as this Apple story. It's like special privilege, abuse of special privilege. Suddenly you're undetectable and you have the highest level privilege and authority. So I think this is a story about how happens all the time. Everybody knows about it. Nobody gets it right. We should be very, very vigilant. So it's not like a worst thing in the world story that never happens. It's more like it happens all the time. And we need to think better about why everyone's doing it wrong, usually.
Yeah, it seems like transparency is the, which is a poison pill for Apple in a lot of ways, is usually the best course of action, long term at least. Next up here, CISA creates exploited bug catalog. This one really jumped out to me when it launched this week. CISA has published a catalog of software vulnerabilities known to be exploited in the wild, issuing a binding operational directive requiring federal agencies to patch these within specified deadlines. The catalog currently includes 306 vulnerabilities across a number of vendors, big names, Cisco, Oracle, Apple, Google, all the names you would expect, with some dating back as far as 2010, which somehow is true, but also feels impossible. For vulnerabilities discovered this year, agencies have until November 17th, 2021 to apply patches. Owner of vulnerabilities, I guess, get grandfathered in. They have till May 3rd, 2022 to be patched. giving deadlines is nice for these kind of things. I'm glad there's an operational directive to actually have these patched now. But does this not have the same danger as vulnerabilities announced on Patch Tuesday in terms of, giving bad guys a big target to aim at? If we know, hey, we need, if you have a 2010 vulnerability, you have until May 3rd to really hammer away at federal systems.
It's a tricky situation. On the one hand, you have the 2010 sort of standing out, like blaring. Okay, this is
sure,
obviously
just the one, but
it's very late. So, and they're being actively exploited. So, to be fair, these are actively exploited things. It's not all bugs. It's things that actually need to be patched because there's going to be someone knocking on them and entering. And that's the real story here. Is you got to patch these things because you're at risk if you don't, and that's safety, and that's great. And that's like recalls on vehicles and so forth. So it's just very good safety advice. But the other side of this is that secrecy is biased. And so if you don't go out and say, hey, everybody do this, but you only go to a few select people because you're trying to avoid the disclosure issue of bringing it to the public too soon for people to exploit it, then who are you really talking to and when? That secrecy turns into all sorts of conspiracy theory. Like if the government's working with Microsoft behind the scenes to get things patched before they release it to the public on Patch Tuesday, for example, it sounds like the government's conspiring with Microsoft to leave certain people vulnerable. And so it's never a clean cut on this topic ever.
Yeah, we kind of covered this last week, talking about that EMSAsoft ransomware decryptor that they had kind of kept to select partners and stuff like that because they were working behind the scene, or because government law enforcement and stuff was working behind the scenes to kind of get at the threat actors on the back end. And it does raise a really interesting question. So it's like, yes, this will be much more effective if we don't blare this out, but also to your point, and especially if this is going to be used, I could definitely see this being used as like a like the barrier of entry, right? For if CISA is recommending this for the feds, we should probably make sure we have all of these checked too. If we're private enterprise, I could definitely see that having a lot of utility of setting at least this minimum bar to meet, right?
Right. The bottom line is privacy and knowledge are oppositional. And so if you have privacy, you have ignorance. And so you don't want people to be ignorant that need knowledge. You don't want people to have knowledge that should be ignorant.
All right. And our final story of the day, cyber criminals sell access to international shipping and logistics giants. Intel 471 has published an analysis of black market trends online, revealing instances of initial access brokers offering access to international shipping and logistic companies across the ground, air, and sea. I guess space is still up for grabs. Although the logistics industry has always been a constant target, big names like Conti and Five Hands are appearing in the IAB research along with many newcomers. So, Davi, this reflects back on our chip shortage story. Supply chain disruptors have already shown how easy they can disrupt the world. Things like Colonial Pipeline and the Suez Canal blockage that we saw memed to hell earlier this year. The internet was originally built as a communications network. No single weak point of failure was, kind of one of the big deals about it. Global supply chain, though, still seems to have a lot of choke points. Is it time for some revolutionary thought about turning the supply chain into some kind of supply net? Is that just purely sophistry, or is that something that's possible?
No, it's absolutely possible. And that's something, Rudolf Diesel famously talked about when he invented his engine was, we'd get fuel sources from local as opposed to centralized, monopolized, plutocracy-based fuel sources. So I think it's a constant a theme in a lot of the supply chain narratives, whether it be engines or militaries, and they talk about having to have oil fields ready so they could fuel the ships, coal, and all sorts of things. I mean, that's fundamentally, that's what comes to mind when I see repair, right to repair, and 3D printing of hardware parts for tanks in the field. Immediately, I think, well, where are they getting their source of energy from? Because another way of saying that, like, you have long lines of supply, is that you have vulnerability in depth. And so it's just weird to me that for so many decades, even centuries, we've talked about supply chains being so vulnerable. I even consulted on this for decades with the military, and it's like people from the military, I should say, ex-military, and it was like the problem was right there in front of us, but it wasn't attacked enough for anyone to really feel like it was pressing unless it was in a war. And so that's what really happened, is that it just wasn't attacked enough to people feel like there was enough awareness. And now it is being attacked, and we're way late because people didn't take precautionary measures. But there's way better solutions. There's all sorts of local, slow-based models of supply. Everything should be, backed up locally so that you don't have to rely on something coming from far away. And that's what we were talking about before with the chips, right? If you had a model where you could actually repair things in the field, then you wouldn't worry so much about your supply chain not delivering anything for 2, 3, 4 weeks. The just-in-time model has a lot of vulnerabilities.
All right, before we get out of here, Davi, anything that was kind of a story that struck you, got a thumbs up or an eye roll from you as we were talking about it?
Well, the Facebook story just kills me because everybody was reporting this as end of Facebook use of facial recognition, even though in the text itself, it always said, no, we're not doing that at all. We're going to continue using facial recognition. And I said, breach. Immediately to my mind came something really bad happened or something was about to happen. They know they were breaking the law and they're trying to cover it up as quickly as possible. And the fact that nobody reported it as something terrible is going on at Facebook, they all reported it as look at how great Facebook is, means we're in serious trouble because no one's really looking at what's happening. They're just reporting what Facebook told them to say. And that's terrible for the security industry, terrible for privacy.
And Davi, where can people find you if they want to hear more about you or the cool stuff that's going on at Inrupt?
Flyingpenguin.com is the best way to find me. I would say LinkedIn, but I get banned there all the time, probably, or going to be banned any minute. But that's probably the best two ways to find me. And then Inrupt, of course, is available at inrupt.com. Or you could also look at the Solid project. That's a good way to find what I'm working on.
Excellent. And of course, we want to thank our sponsor, Trend Micro, for helping make this show possible. Before we get out of here, we just want to say that you can come back next week, Friday, for Friday live content extravaganza. It starts out with our video chat, Hacking Productivity, an hour of critical thinking about how security can improve business operations. That starts at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, followed by a meetup. And then we'll be back with another edition of the Week in Review. It's live every Friday, 12:30 p.m. Pacific, 3:30 Eastern. Davi Ottenheimer, thank you so much. This fascinating conversation. Could talk to you for another 50 minutes at the bare minimum, but I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rich.
All right. Remember, check us all out at CISOseries.com. I'm Rich Straffolino. And until next time we meet, have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOseries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.